everyone. Welcome back. Last time, we studied vocal chamber music, sacred music, and keyboard music from the Baroque period. Today, we will look at chamber of the Baroque period. The reason we divide them like this is just for convenience. In the Baroque period, instrument groups were not fixed or clearly established, and the line between chamber music and orchestra music was not as clear as it is today. At that time, instrumental music was often divided by purpose or place of performance, just like vocal music. Church, theater, chamber. However, in this division, church and theater music were usually centered on singing, so instrumental music had a smaller role. Another interesting point is that each country had its own favorite styles and genres of instrumental music. But we must also remember that most countries influenced each other a lot rather than keeping only their own national style. Before the 17th century, it was up to the performers to decide which instruments to use for a piece. But starting in the 17th century, composers began to choose instruments themselves, considering the special qualities of each instrument. Because of this, just like today, understanding different instruments became an important part of training to be a composer. A composer had to know things such as how wide the range of notes was, what kind of techniques were possible, what kind of sound or tone the instrument produced, what musical patterns were easy to play for each instrument. Without this knowledge, it became impossible to compose music in this period. The most representative instrument for Baroque-era ensemble music, such as sonatas, concerto, and overtures, was the violin. Violin was born late 15th century. Developed and perfected in Italy by makers such as Amati, Stradivari, and Guarneri, the Baroque violin had a lighter build, shorter neck, and gut strings, which gave it a warmer, softer sound compared to the modern violin. It was central in both solo and ensemble music, especially in the concerto and sonata, and helped define the bright, expressive sound of Baroque instrumental music. A luthier is a craftsperson who builds or repairs string instruments. All the techniques used to make modern violins were developed and perfected in the 1700s by three masters from the small Italian city of Cremona: Amati, Stradivari, and Guarneri. The person who first brought violin-making techniques to Cremona and set the basic proportions of the violin was Andrea Amati in the mid-1500s. His grandson, Niccolo Amati, not only improved his techniques but also taught two outstanding students, Antonio Stradivari and Andrea Guarneri. Later, these two students opened their own workshops and made instruments under their own names. The grandson of Andrea Guarneri, Giuseppe Antonio Guarneri, became one of the greatest violin makers, surpassing even his famous teachers. The workshops of Stradivari and Guarneri kept a strong sense of competition, which helped them create some of the finest string instruments made for the violin. They constantly paid careful attention to every detail to make better instruments, such as the size of the violin, the angle and length of the fingerboard, the materials and thickness of the body, the surface, and the shape of the F holes. Because of this, no two of their instruments are exactly the same. The standard form of the violin was finally established in the 18th century. As of September 2025, the most expensive violin on record is the 1715 Stradivarius violin named Baron Knupp. This instrument was sold in early 2023 through a private transaction for about $23 million, making it the highest confirmed price ever paid for a violin. The viola da gamba, literally viol of the leg, was a popular string instrument in the Renaissance and Baroque periods. Unlike the violin family, it was held between the legs like a modern cello. It had 6 or 7 strings and frets, giving it a gentle, soft, and refined tone. The viola da gamba was especially valued for chamber music and solo repertoire, and composers such as Marin Marais in France wrote many works for it. By the late Baroque, however, it began to decline in popularity as the louder, more versatile violin family took over. The cello gradually replaced the viola da gamba during the late Baroque period. While the viola da gamba had frets and softer, delicate sound, the cello, part of the violin family, had a stronger, more resonant tone and no frets, allowing for greater dynamic range and expressive possibilities. This made the cello better suited for both solo performance and large ensembles. By the 18th century, the cello became the main bass instrument in the string family, while the viola da gamba faded into more limited use. In the Baroque era scores, when the term flute was used, it usually referred to the recorder, whereas the transverse flute was specifically indicated as traverso. The recorder has a bright and clear sound. The early transverse flute sounded softer and it wasn't very loud, but by the 18th century, the flute was improved so it could play as loudly as a violin and do virtuosic, fancy techniques. After around 1740, the flute completely replaced the recorder.
B minor is a great key on the flute.
During this time, the oboe was invented and the modern clarinet was also created. In the Baroque period, the roles of the trumpet, horn, and trombone were very different. They looked very different from the brass instruments we see in modern orchestras. The trumpet was mainly a military instrument, while the horn was used by kings and nobles for hunting. The trumpet usually played high notes, and the Baroque trumpet players had the skill to play clearly even in the high range and perform difficult passages. In the Baroque period, percussion instruments were used very little, and their parts were usually not written in the music score. The most common percussion instruments were the timpani or cymbals, which often doubled the bass line played by the trumpet. Timpanis were not used continuously, but rather for special effects. To emphasize moments of festivity and grandeur, like royal ceremonies, coronations. To create dramatic impact at climactic points in a piece. A typical Baroque sonata usually had one or two high-pitched melody instruments, mostly violins, and a basso continuo. If there was only one melody instrument, it was called a solo sonata, and if there were two, it was called a trio sonata. But a trio sonata was not actually played by three people. The word trio meant that the music had three parts. In performance, the cello usually played the bass line, and the harpsichord or organ filled in the harmony. Like this, the basso continuo needed two players. A trio sonata was often performed by four musicians. A solo sonata was played by one skilled virtuoso soloist with the basso continuo, and it can be thought of as an instrumental version of vocum monody. We have Arcangelo Corelli in Italy. Corelli, who was also a famous violinist, is considered the most influential Italian composer after Monteverdi. He spent his whole life writing only instrumental music. Corelli sonatas became an example for many composers to follow. Not only Italian composers like Vivaldi, but also composers from other countries in the 18th century, such as Bach and Handel, copied this style. We have Francois Couperin in France. Couperin mainly composed keyboard and chamber music. He is considered the greatest French Baroque composer, connecting the time between Lully and Rameau. The German Baroque composers did not create completely new genres. Instead, they brought together elements from other musical traditions, such as Italy and France, and combined them in new ways. We have Georg Philipp Telemann. Telemann's music included almost every style that was popular at the time, so it could satisfy many different tastes. His works were published not only in Germany, but also in Paris, France, and they became popular all over Europe, giving him international fame. Telemann was a very prolific composer, writing more than 3,000 pieces, including operas, passion, church cantatas, overtures, concertos, and chamber music. In J.S. Bach's chamber music, the harpsichord plays a very important role. It does not just fill in chords as part of the basso continuo, but also takes part in the ensemble as an independent melodic instrument on equal terms with the other instruments. Although it is not strictly possible to classify them as chamber music, here I want to introduce Bach's unaccompanied works, which show his contrapuntal mastery and musical genius. At that time, unaccompanied works were very rare, but Bach composed six sonatas and partitas for solo violin and six suites for cello. In these works, the violin and cello do not remain as simple melodic instruments, they also take on harmonic and contrapuntal roles on their own. The suites for cello solo fully use the cello's potential in a way that had not been explored before, showing the instrument at its artistic peak. Today, we explored the rich world of Baroque chamber music. We saw how composer wrote for different instruments, considering their unique ranges, techniques, and sounds. Key instruments included the violin, viola da gamba, later replaced by the cello, flute, recorder, oboe, clarinet, and various brass and percussion instruments. We also learned about typical forms like the solo and trio sonata and how composers from Italy, France, Germany, such as Corelli, Couperin, Telemann, and Bach, developed chamber music in unique ways. In particular, Bach expanded the role of harpsichord and wrote unaccompanied works that pushed the expressive and contrapuntal potential of violin and cello to new heights. Baroque chamber music shows a fascinating blend of technical mastery, expressive depth, and stylistic diversity across Europe. That's all for today. See you next class. Bye.